Augustine's significance within the Western intellectual tradition is in part due to his lasting practical value. More than any other patristic theologian, St. Augustine remains a sort of staple of Western cultural and intellectual study and discourse, both as a figure held up as a positive example for our contemporary problems and as a figure guilty of reinforcing issues that we are trying to overcome. Augustine holds an odd place then. He was, more than any other theologian before him, important in developing the doctrine of imago Dei, the image of God, articulating the view that to be made in the image of God meant that humans possessed rationality and desire. We are made in love for love, and in wisdom for wisdom, because God is love itself and reason itself within the Christian theological tradition. This, therefore, must naturally include male and female, and not just male alone. Yet at the same time, he is guilty of upholding Roman patriarchal prejudices, so much so that some scholars assert that he unintentionally paved the way for a misogynistic theology of female inferiority once Augustinian theology was fused with the sexism of Aristotelian philosophy in the medieval age. Yet, as we shall see, this is a deeply one-sided and misrepresentational reading of Augustine on sex and gender. If Augustine's view of sexuality is remembered, it is wrongly remembered as a dismissive critic. Augustine, as this interpretive tradition asserts, was disgusted by sex, and sex is ultimately a sinful activity imposed on humans after the fall of Adam and Eve, and meant only for the procreation of children, and nothing more. This interpretive tradition, as mentioned, distorts and misrepresents two essential threads of thought in Augustine concerning his theology of sex. One Augustine scholar, Patricia Brewer, mentions that sex was possible and permissible in Eden. Adam and Eve would have full control of their bodies in such circumstances, and Augustine describes prelapsarian sex as not only possible, but very likely. This Brewer takes from reading Augustine and his work on the literal meaning of Genesis, where he states rather clearly in confronting the Manichees, who had a very negative and dismissive view of sex, "I do not see what could have prohibited them," speaking of Adam and Eve, "from honorable nuptial union, and the bed undefiled, even in paradise." The word undefiled in Latin that Augustine uses is immaculatus, or immaculate. Augustine did, later in his life, amid the theological controversies dealing with Manichaean heresy, affirm the reality of sex in the Garden of Eden, as we've just stated, and even considered it as immaculate, something so immaculate and remarkable prior to the fall. Sex was not an imposition of punishment, but something so tremendously remarkable that he uses the term immaculate to describe it. It is, therefore, an expression of the life of grace, if grace covers up our mortal natures. Because love of another is also part of what it means to be made in the image of God, Augustine defends the goodness of human passions, which obviously includes sex and sexual desire, against the critics of human pathology, the Manichaeans and the Stoics. This does, however, of course, come with the caveat of human passion being rightly ordered, Augustine's famous phrase, ordo amoris. Human rationality, the soul, must order the passions to the highest good, which is God. And Augustine does privilege male rationality as superior to female rationality. This all scholars can plainly see in his writings. Thus, Augustine does develop the right use of sex in marriage for the procreation of children. Nevertheless, as numerous scholars point out, Brewer among them, Augustine's view of marriage doesn't entail the eventual scholastic teleological view that marriage is meant for the procreation of children. Sex in marriage for Augustine is simply meant for that, but marriage itself can be separated from the procreation of children in Augustine's view, and therefore marriage is primarily about fidelity to the beloved, and not necessarily for the procreation of children. Augustine does not have the scholastic teleological view of marriage wherein you marry in order to bring about children into the world. Augustine's view of marriage is tethered to his idea of love. Loving faithfulness to one's spouse is the highest reality of marriage. Loving faithfulness is the purpose that we marry. It is the love of another that binds two together. Here too then does Augustine's reflection of human love as being a means to love God now make more sense in De Trinitate when he writes, "This word is conceived in love of either the creature or the creator, that is, of the changeable nature or unchangeable truth, which means either in covetousness or in charity. Not that the creature is not to be loved, but if that love is related to the creator, it is no longer covetousness, but charity. The lower creature should be used to bring us to God. The creature on a par should be enjoyed, but in God." In other words, when you recognize God in others, loving them is a means of loving God. And that is a beautiful and rapturous reality for human relationships. Our passions are aroused through loving another because God is there. Our arousal is the great romance with divinity. And mind you, Augustine also writes in his homilies on the first letter of John that love itself is divine. That feeling of love that we have is the reality of God moving in us. And why the soul must then order the passion is through that recognition of the divine reality of love. Our passions become disordered when we separate it from God. Our passions are rightly ordered in the sense that we rightly understand what we are feeling and experiencing when we recognize God in our emotions. Thus, unlike the Manichaeans and the Stoics, Augustine does have a very positive view of the human passions, of human emotion, and this extends to the reality of marriage, where faithfulness and love of one's spouse is the true purpose of marriage. Yes, perhaps children might result from that union, but it is principally the love of the other, the love of the beloved, the love that lover and beloved share for each other. That is the true meaning and the true purpose of marriage. So if sex wasn't a punishment for the fall, but something immaculate in our prelapsarian existence, and if fidelity to one's spouse is the highest reality of marriage, as many Augustine scholars point out, again, Brewer among them, this allows us to understand something quite remarkable in Augustine's treatment of his common law wife in the Confessions. Gary Willis named Augustine's common law wife Una because she was described as the one according to Augustine. And thus I am going to use the name Una because that humanizes her rather than just calling her his wife. Brewer notes on this point that Una was neither overcome by concupiscence of the flesh, she is said to have returned to Africa, vowing celibacy, nor overwhelmed by the concupiscence of the heart, compelled by desire and love, she makes what seems to be the right choice, which Augustine clearly envies. She is a better Adam. I'm going to repeat this because what Brewer says here is very remarkable and very important for us to understand. Una was neither overcome by concupiscence of the flesh, she is said to have returned to Africa, vowing celibacy, nor overwhelmed by the concupiscence of the heart, compelled by desire and love, she makes what seems to be the right choice, which Augustine clearly envies. She is a better Adam. When Augustine and Una have to break up due to the circumstances of their life trajectories, Augustine notes that Una, although she left him, or rather he left her, she vowed perpetual faithfulness to Augustine. She was never going to stop loving Augustine, and she knew, as Augustine did not know at that moment, but only knew later in his life, that true love is fidelity to the other. So even though they were separated from each other's arms, she never stopped loving him. And she declares that she will never stop loving Augustine. Augustine does not say that of her. In fact, I would go further than Brewer and say that an implicit arc of the narrative of the Confessions is Augustine's own personal retelling of an Edenic story, with him as Adam and Una as Eve. And he does conclude that Una was his superior, and by extension, therefore, also Adam's better, in choosing rightly ordered love, fidelity, faithfulness, amid their non-sacramental union and eventual separation. Augustine does periodically acknowledge the superiority of women to men in his writing, something that was scandalous in the ancient world. All one needs to do is read Aristotle's comments of women to see that contrast. Far from just seeing sex as a repulsive reality imposed as a punishment after the fall, Augustine does have an implicitly exalted view of sex, even if in those limited applications, like bringing forth children into the world. As something immaculate in our prelapsarian existence, it is, therefore, a gift from God. It is not a punishment. Furthermore, while he does often promote and speak of male superiority to female uncontrollability, this, as mentioned, is upended by some of his own writings and acknowledgments where he does place females as being higher and superior and better to their male counterparts. Una in comparison to him, and Monica to Patrick, Augustine's father. There is room, as various scholars note, for Augustine to be a friend and ally to the pain and sorrow of women. And this too is true in Augustine's complicated defense of women raped by the Goths and in Roman history, as he writes about this in The City of God. The Christian women raped by Roman men, barbaric men, in Rome during Alaric's sack, are exonerated of any wrongdoing. And this, in fact, is very scandalous in the late antique world, where women defiled, even in rape, are usually blamed by the law and male magistrates for their defilement. Augustine takes the opposite view. It is the men who committed the act that are guilty of a heinous crime. And not only is this true for the Christian women who were defiled by Alaric's soldiers, this was true even in ancient Roman history, through his declaration that Lucretia was free of any wrongdoing when raped by Sextus Tarquinius. Augustine is capable of great sympathy for the plight of women, and occasionally, as just mentioned, exonerates them against male accusations and accusers and sexual violence, and even thinks some women are again superior to their male counterparts in virtue. Augustine isn't the big bad baddie of male misogyny that he is often proclaimed to be. Carrying on this theme that Una was conceived by Augustine as his better, the medieval and patristic scholar Richard A. Lee Jr. explores the role of women in the Confessions, and whether or not the feminist scholarly assertions that Augustine erases them and their agency is an accurate presentation of the doctrine of grace. Lee does acknowledge and painstakingly shows why this reading of the Confessions is not entirely or altogether wrong. Augustine is the star of the Confessions. The few women who appear are left nameless except for Monica. He does erase their agency by ascribing either God's will or his own lustful heart as overriding the actions of the women around him, such as when he credits God, not his nurses, with feeding him in his infancy, or by denying Una agency in their relationship. Yet the singular portrait, as Lee points out, is a misleading picture, for again, it fails to recognize that remarkable ending with Una. In her recent book, Queens of a Fallen World, which I've reviewed, Kate Cooper offers a sympathetic reading of the women in the Confessions and argues that one of the reasons why so many women might be left nameless is because Augustine sought to protect their identity from what he clearly came to realize was his own wrongdoing. This helps us make sense then why Augustine ascribes his own agency over Una, effectively, in some sense, erasing her agency in their sinful non-sacramental union, to be sure, but the reason for this is because she is actually blameless of any sin, and Augustine, knowing very well the male patriarchal culture of the late antique Roman world that he lived in, one in which the law, magistrates, and judges would often blame women for their own suffering, he did not want that to happen to Una. Augustine, not Una, is guilty of the sin of their non-sacramental union. The female is free and pure. The man is guilty and impure. When female agency does emerge amid its burial by Augustine in the Confessions, as Lee points out, it is actually a most remarkable moment. Again, returning to the last episode of Una and Augustine's time together, Lee writes of this most astonishing reversal of sexual norms by saying, her desire is multiple. It is for the happiness of their son and also probably for Augustine, but it is also toward the love they had together. I will never know someone as I know you is probably the proclamation of faith that founds any relationship that is worthy of the name love. In this sense, she, the one, Augustine's spouse, has the final agency that he cannot recuperate. We loved, now vow, and Augustine failed. Again, I'm going to reread what Lee writes in this most remarkable moment, just like as Patricia Brewer wrote, in order to underscore this truly remarkable moment. This is the world in which women are blamed for their suffering. This is the world in which women are blamed for divorce. This is the world where women are held as inferior to men. And while Augustine often endorses this view in many of his writings, he does not do it here in the Confessions. Her desire is multiple. It is for the happiness of their son, and probably for Augustine, but it is also toward the love they had together. I will never know someone as I know you is probably the proclamation of faith that founds any relationship that is worthy of the name love. In this, she, the one, Augustine's spouse, has the final agency that he cannot recuperate. We loved, now vow, and Augustine failed. Lee recognizes here what many other scholars, myself included, see in the complicated construction of Una in Augustine's Confessions. In their final moment together, Augustine exonerates her of wrongdoing and gives her the final say. She is clearly his better. Moreover, as I think is evident once the relational narrative of the Confessions as a retelling of the garden story is understood, Augustine is wrecked by the guilt that she is his superior, and he alters the common patristic view of marriage, entailing the procreation of children to now mean fidelity. Faithfulness in marriage is the highest calling, not the bringing forth of children. Why? Because Una was always faithful to Augustine, whereas Augustine was not faithful to her. Una's virtue was her loving fidelity, something that Augustine never forgot. And when Augustine attacks the Stoic and Manichaean dismissiveness toward human passion and proclamation of self-sufficient rationalist male virtue, he drew upon Una's loving faithfulness to articulate a philosophy of virtue based on love, emotion, and passion rather than pure human intellect. This allows us to now look at Augustine's discussion of emotion and passion in his conflict with the Stoics and the Manichaeans. Again, one of the older interpretive traditions about Augustine's view of emotions and gender is that he promotes female weakness in contradistinction to male strength. As with Augustine's view of sex and female relations, as we've been covering, this is too one-sided, as the great medieval and Augustine scholar Elaine Sweeney shows. Sweeney doesn't back away from those moments of Augustine's slippage into the male superiority complex, where rationality is generally viewed as male and the inability to control one's emotions and passions is associated with female danger and often temptation. But this reading fails to recognize the profound change in Augustine's articulation of a moral pathology and psychology, which does, in fact, uphold human emotions and passions as something good and something that makes us fully human. As Sweeney writes, Augustine criticizes the Stoic position on the passion and virtues, strongly endorsing emotions, both positive and negative, as part of a fully human good life. Augustine's sometimes contradictory psychology of the passions, nevertheless, helps him to paradoxically produce an important shift in our understanding of human emotion and the virtuous life. The language of love, Sweeney writes in assessing Augustine, has in effect superseded the language of virtue. We shall quote Augustine here to underscore what Sweeney is saying. As Augustine writes, temperance is love offering itself in its integrity to the beloved. Fortitude is love easily tolerating all things on account of the beloved. Justice is loving, serving the beloved alone, and as a result, ruling righteously. And prudence is love that wisely separates those things by which it is helped from those by which it is impeded. Augustine here explains the virtues in terms of human love, which is not a rational reality, but a pathological, passionate, and emotional reality. If love defines us as humans, and if love is the true cause of any virtues we may acquire, then the logic of female pathology must include the possibility of their virtuousness. This, it seems to me, is something Augustine took from his relationship with Una and his mother, both of whom, again, are depicted as superior to their male counterparts in the Confession, Una with Augustine and Monica with Patrick. Furthermore, in reevaluating the ancient world's sexual psychology of active male and passive female souls, Augustine doubled down with Origen that the nature of the Christian soul and the church itself in relationship to Christ is female. God acts first, and we, the bride, receive God in the person of Jesus Christ. No pure misogynist could ever accept that reality that the Christian soul, in its virtuous love of God, is female. Yet that is exactly what Augustine concludes. Sweeney says that Augustine rejects male self-sufficiency, although he cannot escape his discomfort with feminine passion, often reverting to his need to be mastered by male reason. And this is all true. But we might say, in an ironic twist, just as Sweeney and so many other scholars have pointed out, that this is because Augustine saw himself as another failed Adam, which made him too much like the females who plunged themselves to their death over love lost and betrayed, Lucretia and Dido. For Augustine does famously say he wept with Dido upon reading Virgil's Aeneid, and didn't identify himself with the Stoic hero Aeneas. Instead, he identified with Dido. And yet again, in Augustine's treatment of Lucretia and of Dido, we find the spirit of sympathy and not condemnation or contempt. Male figures are to blame for their eventual deaths. And so again, in this ironic twist in which Augustine sees his own uncontrollable passions as if him being feminine, he also recognizes himself, being a male, as another failed Adam. And by contrast, it is Una and Monica, though they be females, though they be daughters of Eve, who were the better and superiors to their male counterparts. And so too is this true for Lucretia and Dido. So even though Augustine does, as Sweeney mentions, reject that Stoic male self-sufficiency model, and even though he cannot escape his discomfort with feminine passion, often reverting to its need to be mastered by male reason, Augustine's use of female and male archetypes and heroes and protagonists is much more complicated than the misogynistic interpretation of Augustine lets on. Yes, Augustine is a product of his world, but even in that world, as we've been discussing in this lecture, he offers brilliant glimpses, even if only briefly, of what our relationships with others could be when based on the love and the fidelity, the sympathy and the sorrow that he often explored in his many writings, even if he was ultimately incapable of freeing himself from the Roman world in which he walked. Augustine, in many ways, ancient and unmodern as he was, laid the seeds for some very modern ideas to eventually emerge. That human passion and emotion is good, that the human heart is good in its desires, and that faithfulness between lover and beloved, a reality we simultaneously embody as men and as women, is the true meaning of love and therefore marriage itself. Furthermore, Augustine does break through that sexist and misogynistic male patriarchal philosophy of the Stoics, of the Manichaeans, and of other patristic church fathers. Although these moments are brief, he does show in the Confessions, in the City of God, and in various other writings that there are moments when women really are the better of men.